thank you, Ashley, and thanks for everyone who's participating in this. It's an honor to be able to talk about IACs, and I will go ahead and at this point share my screen so we can get started with um, the portion that everyone can see. Okay, perfect. All right. Well, as I said, my name's Aaron Vorell, and I've had the privilege of being with Casa de Amma for 19 and a half years. We have our 20th anniversary next April. And it's been an incredible journey, incredible experience, learning a lot. And today I wanted really accomplish three different things. First is to tell you some history about how the independent apartment community concept came to be, and really at its roots is the Casa de Amma story. Second, I want to tell you really what is an independent apartment community. And then third, to be able to explain, if you're interested in being a part of an independent apartment community, or as I'll refer to typically as an IAC, what you can do, what are some helpful hints to get started. We've held, I believe, 5 symposiums in the past. Haven't done anything post-COVID, but plan to do some of those again in the near future, where we really get down into the nitty-gritty with full day sessions as far as this. But let me just start off as well before I get into this by saying, and I think this is important, that I certainly do not in any way believe one model is better than the others. I think that there are some models out there that are less than desirable. Typically some of the older models that, I think are just outdated as far as service models, but this is not meant to hold an IAC up over another type of a community. I think at the end of the day, we need more communities, we need more options, and every adult with IDD needs different types of things, and every family is looking for different settings. So an IAC, there are some things that kind of narrow down the scope of what it is, but the essence of an IAC, I think you can find in any program that ultimately is successful and is doing its mission, which at the end of the day is supporting the individual and the family. So to get started, independent apartment communities. So really the story of an IAC starts with the Casa de Amma story. And that really starts with 2 parents and a 20-year-old son named Doug. So Doug, similar to a lot of young adults, when he was in high school, in junior high, they knew he had some learning disabilities. They were not very keen on getting diagnoses, and especially at that time, the idea of getting a diagnosis came with that all the negative stigma. So they very much were trying to help him with his learning disabilities. They were thinking he was going to grow out of some of the social issues that came with ultimately what his disability was. And when he started high school, things were not going well at all, socially, academically, with his family. And they were fortunate to find a school on the East Coast. And when he started attending that towards his later years in high school, but especially their post-secondary program, for the first time, everything started to click. And for them, the way they would describe that is, yes, academically, he was learning, but more importantly, for the first time, he had a group of friends that were similar to him, that accepted him for who he was, and that he believed were truly his friends. And they saw that with their daughter, who was neurotypical, but had never seen that with their son. So when they would come and visit him, they just saw that his life had transformed. And they were sitting around one time in a gym when the families were all talking. He was guided by a staff member there at that school in the post-secondary program. And they were discussing, well, what's next? And as is the case for a lot of families whose young adult is 20 or 21, they haven't really started thinking a lot about that because they're just enjoying and putting work into the moment. And as they started to hear the reality that oftentimes, we kind of refer to it as the cliff, when people hit 22, of the lack of programs, the lack of support, all of the families around them started getting worried. And at that time, Russ's mother had gone and moved into a small assisted senior living. It wasn't one of the large ones, it was very small. And he started thinking, the way this is set up, I could see this benefiting my son and this group of friends, because they have staff available, but they also have independence. And the staff are able to not only provide the obvious supports, but are able to provide all the unscheduled and unplanned types of things. And he started talking to the other families through a few different of these parent sessions about this idea. And it quickly went from a discussion where people said that sounds great to the concept of if you build it, we will come. And most of the families that he was talking to were from the East Coast, and Russ and Susie, his wife, were from the West Coast. So they wanted to build it on the West Coast. And even these families who were on the East Coast who never thought they would live with their kid on the other side of the country, as they surveyed what was currently available, they loved the idea of Casa de Amma. And long story short, the family found the lot here in San Juan Capistrano, California, built the building, and since then it's been history. We've been open for 19 and a half years. So it wasn't until about 10, 11 years after Casa's opening that I started to develop this idea of IAC. And the attempt was partially, how do I articulate what the Casa model is without just having it be about Casa? And how do I articulate it in a way that doesn't just hold Casa up, but also takes in some best practices that we see in other programs that might not be exactly like Casa? So as we begin to do that, that's where the concept of the IAC community started. And I think if we look, this is a quote from the United States Congress in 1990 with the Americans with Disabilities Act. And it says, historically, society has tended to isolate and segregate individuals with disabilities. And despite some improvements, such forms of discrimination against individuals with disabilities continue to be a serious and pervasive social problem. And I read this anew when I was planning our first symposium about 7 or 8 years ago. And I was struck with the idea that while this was written in 1990, most of us that work in the field and the families would say this is still, unfortunately, pretty accurate today. There is a lot of isolation, there can be a segregation, there can be discrimination, all these types of things. So certainly the ADA Act has helped us tremendously, but at the same time, there is a lot of work to be done. And that is part of why we created this IAC group where we articulate this model and assist people. And then next, this is something that I wrote down, the idea that increasingly advocates and legislators are pushing to end any kind of housing and service options that resemble a restrictive or isolative environment. And while we would all agree adults with disabilities shouldn't be isolated or, quote, institutionalized, there is much disagreement on what these terms mean and what program housing options lead to isolation. Early on in Casa's time, we were doing some consulting with a program where the family lived in Oregon. And in Oregon, they have a law that if they're using any kind of state funding, there cannot be more than 4 or 5 people with IDD living under the same roof line. And that was created because there were institutions up until about 15 years ago in Oregon. But an unintended consequence was that if people wanted to live together and more than 5 people, they legally could not with getting state funding. So one of the things that I've come to realize is I think the pendulum has really swung to the opposite direction. And while we were trying to offer, kind of get out of those days of institutions, really the idea is that with progress, sometimes progress doesn't know where to stop. And that's where that pendulum swang. And the IAC model is trying to bring us back a little bit more to the middle and trying to take the best of both extremes without oftentimes having the negative parts. So with that, let me move on. So oftentimes, the buzzword in our professional circles would be independence, right? When you meet with families, you meet with people in our field, and everyone uses the word independence. It's a concept that the individuals want. It's a concept that families want. But what I found in talking to families is that in their search for independence, a lot of times seldom acknowledged synonyms of independence tend to be isolation and vulnerability. And it wasn't too long ago that I was talking to a family and their son, for the sake of the story, I'll call him Tom. He had lived on his own in his family's hometown. He had support, he had a job. So he had all of these things that the family thought he needed. But at the end of the day, he was very alone. If the family couldn't be with him and create an activity for him to be a part of, he really wasn't doing much outside of work with his coworkers, His neighbors in the apartment building that he lived in were kind to him, but they weren't real friends. And slowly he started to become taken advantage of. And it came to see the family actually said something to me that I never forgot. And they said, I used to think that it was all about independence, but now I know independence by itself is no different than isolation. And that really struck with me, this concept of, well, we want independence, we want people to grow in their independent skills. What we don't want that to lead to is people having jobs, having support, maybe doing it, quote unquote, more on their own, but then leading to that isolation and the vulnerability that comes with that. And that's really where the idea of the IAC started. So asking the question, what is an IAC? So an IAC is an acronym for an independent apartment community. And each one of those words was chosen particularly, and each one of them has a very long definition. For the sake of this talk, I'm going to summarize it pretty briefly. But if you look at our website, independentapartmentcommunities.com, there's a lot more information on there. But let me, for the sake of this talk, just talk briefly about each one. So first of all, independent. So the concept of independence, as I mentioned, is a foundational value for any housing and support model for those with IDD. And independence is critical. And independence isn't just a name, that it does have a distinct meaning. So independence is central to all the efforts that we have supporting those with IDD, because it recognizes and is committed to the idea that each person should be enabled to live their life in a manner that is as free as possible from the control or unwanted influence of others. As it relates to the first word in an IAC, independent describes the type of program an IAC is committed to. For any IAC, there isn't just one program being offered. Instead, there is separate programs for each person, each as unique as the person's fingerprint. And we really believe that at Casa, and I know so many other great programs do, where when we refer to Casa, we don't have a program. We support currently 44 people here, and we truly have 44 separate programs. Now, that's not easy from a staffing standpoint. That's not the most effective way to run a business. But when it comes to the concept of independence, that's the only way to run an organization where we're giving people dignity and where we're giving people the ability to truly be themselves. And that begs the question, well, why independence? Independence is central, again, to all the efforts that we do when we're supporting adults with IDD. So why independence? Again, it's central to all of our efforts. It recognizes personal worth. Oftentimes I've seen some programs that maybe they're one size fits all. And by doing that, the focus is on the program and what it offers and what it doesn't offer versus the individual and what they need. And as we all know, individuals need different things as they age, as things change. And any kind of a good program, and I think the concept of an IAC is that the staff and the management are willing to change and adapt. Obviously, there might be some limits based on what the program can do, but they're willing to adapt and change to allow for independence because we recognize the personal worth of each individual. Another reason why independence is it's committed to the dignity of the individual. And that's, every program would put up that they believe in the dignity of the individual, but I think it's one of those things that ultimately you have to be committed to it day in and day out. And again, it's one of those things that isn't easy. We have a joke, or I have a joke sometimes when some of our staff are bemoaning some of the extra work that has to go in because we're not doing things the same. And I'll very much jokingly say, if it just wasn't for these residents, this job would be so easy. And obviously I'm joking, but what that gets at the heart of, and that makes them smile and it makes them realize, oh yeah, that's what we're here for, right? We're not here to make our job easier. We're not here to streamline the organization. We are here to work with each individual and give them the dignity that they so deserve and that their parents certainly want as well. Another reason independence is it requires more work, but as I talked about, that's okay. So more work means more success, and that's something that's so critical for any IAC or any organization to grasp from the top down. So on our walls, we actually have this statement, and we have it in multiple areas in the staffing office, and it's something we review a lot. And it says the independence is central to all efforts supporting those with IDD because it recognizes and is committed to the idea that each person should be enabled to live their life in a manner that is as free as possible from the control or unwanted influence of others. As it relates to the first word in an IAC, independent describes the type of program an IAC is committed to. And as I mentioned earlier, for any IAC, there isn't just one program being offered. Instead, there are multiple programs. So again, as we're looking at independence, we want to talk about how does an IAC stay committed to independence? And actually, this is I mistakenly quoted the last thing. This is what we have on our walls. And for us, this is specific to CASA, but I think this is an important creed for any organization. The fact that as an IAC, we should do everything we can for each resident within their scope of services, always working to give each person the support they need, willing to be creative and stretched for the residents' benefit, while also maintaining safety, professional boundaries, and common sense for the good of the organization. And for us, this serves as sort of our true north of how do we stay committed to the individual, but also still have some type of boundaries, realistic boundaries for what we can do. And I think that's critical. So again, independent is so important for us. In an independent program, again represents the commitment of an IAC not to give into a one-size-fits-all approach, but to show the inherent worth of each person by being committed to tailoring supports in a way that is responsive, considerate of needs, and open to new ideas. And this reminded me of a story of a gentleman who came to us pretty early on, and his name was Hank. And when he came to CASA, he was very angry because he believed, based on the program he was at previously and the school he was at, that the pinnacle of independence, and if he did all he could do, and in a sense, sometimes he would say if he was good and worked hard enough, then he could live on his own. And then he believed, and whether this program meant to or not, he believed that that was the ultimate in success. And he saw it with his brothers. He saw it with people around him that he went to high school with that didn't have IDD. And when he came, he was really angry because he wanted freedom, freedom in his mind. But the reality was he had significant needs. So he thought living in a place with others with disabilities and with support staff was somehow him not achieving and working hard enough. But you know what, over time, we worked with him day after day, week after week, and we worked to show him that just because there's staffing around, he doesn't have to take any of that support. It's tailored to him, and he does have independence. He can come and go as he wants. He has his own apartment. And at one point he said, and I'm paraphrasing, this isn't an actual quote, he said that, you know, when I came here, I really wanted freedom like my brothers have. But I've realized that you're not trying to just control me. You're here to help. And I do admit that I need help. And since then, he's really begun to flourish. And part of that was coming to grips with his disability and his challenge. But part of that was also realizing that this idea of independence doesn't have to always look like someone living by themselves in an apartment. And another kind of cute and funny story that I just want to tell briefly that reminds me of the concept of independence. We had another resident named Greg, and he had a full hemispherectomy when he was a child due to the fact that he was having over 100 seizures a day. And the result of that was he had some significant physical disabilities. He had significant challenges out of one of his eyes, and he also had significant cognitive disabilities. But for Greg, all he wanted was to get his driver's license. And we would talk to him about that, you know, what's important about your driver's license. We would discuss steps, and we would even help him study for his, the first step is to go do the written test. We just support him with that. And one point, his mom actually paid for him to go to a DMV in the local area and do a driving simulator. And he did that. And afterwards he came back and I asked him how it went. And he kind of laughingly said, "Pretty good, but I did run over 3 people." And, of course, he thought that was kind of funny, not realizing that in the real world, that would have grave consequences. And initially, a lot of the staff would try to, and his mom especially, would sort of try to talk him out of this idea of getting your license. You don't really need your license. You're so fortunate that you have staff to drive you, all these other things. But one time we were in his apartment and we were discussing the license thing again. And instead of the usual of trying to explain how life could still be fulfilling without the license, I started to talk to him about, well, what's really important for you to have a license? And we were going back and forth. And then he said something that I'll never forget. He said, "Well, adults have driver's license, and I just want to be normal like every other adult that I see." And what we realized is when we're trying to offer our residents independence, that a lot of times what we're trying to do is trying to understand for them, what does normality look like? How can we help them get as close as that as possible while offering dignity? So we purposefully talked to his mom and stopped the idea of trying to talk him out of this concept. We supported him, but the reality was he was never going to get a driver's license. But we started to understand that it wasn't about the driver's license. It was about being quote unquote normal. And what were other things that looked like normal to him? And how could we help him accomplish those types of things? So at the end of the day, independence is a key concept and a key value when it comes to an IAC. The second word and concept is apartment. So some important distinctions of an apartment would be having your own front door key. So our residents have both a front door key to get into the building. There's a single door that lets you into the building. And then they have a key to get a separate key that gets them into their front door of their apartment. So that is their own apartment. They have a lease, they have a front door key. We can't just enter their apartment. It's the same as any other apartment that you or I might live in when it comes to that. A second distinction is that they have a choice of utilities. It doesn't just come with certain utilities and like it or not, but they have a choice of whether it's cable, different types of internet, different types of, of course, cell reception, those types of things. Then all of them have different desires, and by us assisting them and supporting them, they can have those same things that their other family members and those they see around them have. Another distinction of an apartment would be ideally an option for private rooms and bathrooms. One of the things that we found is oftentimes when we have new people coming in and we're assessing them and we look at their paperwork and we start seeing that there was possibly even physical altercations or social issues, a lot of times it's because people were sharing bedrooms or bathrooms. I'll always remember one girl in particular who was living in a program where 5 of the girls shared one bathroom. And the program had very clearly, and in my opinion, a bit demeaningly written down that she wasn't patient, she wasn't willing to work with others. And I thought, wow, if I had to share a bathroom with 5 other people, I don't think I would be very kind. And I think I'd be a little demanding too. So part of the IAC concept is not putting them in situations that would cause or exacerbate social challenges that already exist. And certainly a private room or a bathroom are part of that. Another key part to an IAC when it comes to the apartment is living space in conjunction with others with IDD. So it's not an inclusive environment in the sense of that we have adults that are neurotypical living here. Maybe we have seniors here. There's nothing wrong with those types of programs. But for us and our residents, they're making the choice to live with others that have similar life stories. And with that, we found the opportunity to create really amazing friendships. And it doesn't mean they don't have contact with other adults without some type of IDD, but that's part of the independent apartment community, is that we are exclusive in that. And while that's not always looked upon fondly, we certainly don't back down from that. We believe that that should be a choice. We don't believe that should be the only option, but for us, it's worked really well. And for our residents, it's worked really well as well. And a fifth part of the apartment distinction is staffing supports on site. Just recently, we were in some meetings with the regional center working on funding for a few of our residents. And the concept of our structured supports, but then also all of the support we provide, because we have on-site staffing 24/7, is really immeasurable when it comes to the hours of support we're providing. And as we all know, right, you can't schedule crises, you can't schedule problems that come up throughout the day. Things like breaking up with your boyfriend or getting in an argument with your parents, right? Those don't happen when it's perfectly timed that a support staff is there to support you. So this on-site staffing support is something that's critical for our model, and has really offered the ability to grow in independence. And ultimately, it's allowed for a lot of things that in other models might fall through the cracks, for us to be able to address those and deal with them in a much more timely manner. Lastly, and I think probably the most important when it comes to the IAC, is the concept of community. And I like this quote from Helen Keller: "Alone we can do so little, but together we can do so much." And one of my favorite stories, and it's happened almost every time, when we have a new resident move in, probably about day 3 to 5, we'll get a call, typically from the mom, and they'll call us and they'll sound a little worrisome, and we're wondering, what's going on? Is everything okay? Can we help? And they say, you know what? I should be happy about this, but every time I call my son or daughter, they tell me, Mom, I'm too busy with my friends right now, I can't talk. And usually then they start to well up in tears a little bit and say, this is what I've always dreamed of, but I didn't realize this was going to be so hard. And it reminds them of taking some of their other kids to college or those other types of things. But the community piece is so critical, and oftentimes is missing for adults with IDD living in different settings in the community. So I think the most unique and likely beneficial part of an IAC is represented in the word community. And again, for many individuals and their families, isolation, loneliness, vulnerability are some of the biggest challenges when it comes to long-term housing and support. And you can hire staff to provide so many other things, but truly creating community is not something that comes easily. And how we do that, some of the more important things, I think, when it comes to creating community, is this concept of what's more important, quality time or quantity time. And I think the reality is that all relationships grow best with quantity time, right? Maybe with a spouse or a family member you haven't seen, you say, let's schedule some quality time. And you go out and you have for an hour or two, you're able to talk. Well, that is only possible because you've had quantity time and built up that relationship. For our residents and for a lot of adults with IDD, quantity time is usually the base of building those friendships, being able to get to know each other through shared interests, activities, experiences. And adults with disabilities are no different, though they benefit from quality time. A lot of times the ability to, what I like to call, rub shoulders and form meaningful relationships is really so critical. And part of how that's done is the fact that we have multiple social settings, whether it's great rooms, different types of rooms that allow for social opportunity, where residents are maybe going from one place to the other and they stop to play a game, they stop to hang out. It's interesting, in an IAC model, a lot of our residents who lack some of the initiation skills and lack some of the social skills, they'll purposefully just go sit in the lobby or one of the great rooms, and they'll wait till other residents come around, and then they'll be invited into activities. And over time, they learn to initiate that on their own. But a lot of times, if they were living on their own, they wouldn't be able to do that, or the thought of a community house that is, somewhat far away is just something that's a little bit too daunting for them. So in an IAC, community is truly built in. The ongoing social opportunities and support, oftentimes we refer to here at Casa as there's a community within the community. All of our residents are going out into the greater community, but when they come home, they're coming home to a community where residents have the ability to create meaningful friendships through social contact, program opportunities, while also still being connected to the outside community on a daily basis. And I think this unique combination really allows for a true sense of community and relationships. And one of the things we also call is a place to belong. And we've seen it time and time with our residents of truly having friendships that are their own and that are valued. So let me now briefly go over some of the distinctions of an independent apartment community. And we've created 10 of them. These are not hard and fast. And, I don't believe in any way in labeling programs IAC in the terms of you either are or aren't. Really what this is just, these are distinctions that we consider, for us at least, a lot of them to be best practices for this model. I've seen very successful programs that only have a couple of these. So in no way am I putting these forward as things you have to have, but through our experience, we've been able to work and do consulting with at least 5 to 6 other programs that are up and running that were modeled after us, and we're working with many others, and we've seen these things bear out as very successful. So the first distinction of an IAC would be offering housing and support services for adults with developmental and intellectual disabilities. So the fact that we do both, and a lot of times that's looked down upon, but the idea that we're able to have our staff, and one of the most important things I believe is that we can create a culture around our staff. One of the things we tell our staff, we just have a new staff actually starting today, and last week in her interview, we were talking about that no matter what your job description is, no matter which area of the program you come in, what we want all of our staff to be is experts on our residents. Because if you know the individual, you can then figure out how to work with them in your service area. But no matter how good you are in your service area, if you don't know the individual, you're not going to be able to work with them in the most effective manner. Second distinction would be that the programming and supports offered by the IAC are comprehensive, optional, individualized, flexible, and person-centered. So there's a lot there that I could unwrap, but just basically the idea that we, as an IAC, we truly offer very comprehensive supports, really everything other than direct medical care, but also they're optional. They're not mandatory. If a person's independent in a certain area or wants to be independent, we're not going to force anything on them. They're individualized, they're flexible, and of course, person-centered. Third is that an IAC will be dedicated to not creating any community rules that limit individualization and person-centered plans and freedom of each resident. I'll always remember when we first started, I started with Casa the month we opened, but we had a couple directors for our first 3 years until I became the executive director. And they were all wonderful in many ways. But I remember at one point there was the idea of let's create a rule sheet and let's put it in the common room. And the staff at the time thought it was a great idea. I mentioned some thoughts about why that might not be a good idea. But inevitably, when we put these rules out, what did we get? We started getting the residents coming into the office saying, so-and-so is breaking this rule, so-and-so is doing that. And then residents going right up to a rule. So while we do have rules, we don't want to start with what you can't do or what we don't do. We want to start with enabling them to be respectful, kind to one another, but also not creating artificial rules that a lot of times, unfortunately, we see in programs that work with adults with disabilities that don't mimic the real world. But because there's individualized, some of our residents do have certain plans that would limit certain things that might put them in danger, but they've agreed to it, their families agreed to it. So that personalized nature is critical. A fourth distinctive of an IAC would be having individual apartments in the building with limited shared bedrooms or bathrooms. So most apartments are 1 bedroom, that they have their own space. We do have some 2 bedrooms, and in those 2 bedrooms, they each have their own bedroom and bathroom. So again, that ability to retreat to your own space, to have it be, furnished and painted and everything that represents the individual, but then to also have this community within a community right outside their front door. The fifth distinctive would be a building with shared front doors to access the apartment community. We found that this is really critical for a number of reasons. Again, there can be great programs in your typical apartment buildings that the apartments open up to a hallway or open up to a parking lot. But one of the things we found with the shared front doors is it creates, number one, an extra level of safety for our residents, but also it creates an environment where residents walk in. almost every time a resident walks in, they're greeted by 2 or 3 people. And what a great feeling that is for any of us to be greeted, to be valued, that people know when they're coming and going. Just the other day I heard from a resident, oh, where have you been for the last 2 days? I haven't seen you. Oh, I was with my mom. So that kind of feeling of being known and knowing each other is something that is created oftentimes through some of these physical distinctions in the building. Our sixth distinctive is that all residents have their own building front door and apartment keys, and can access the building and their apartment independently at any time. So some residents have individualized rules that kind of limit when they come and go, which again, they agree to. But generally speaking, there's no apartment curfew for everyone, because we have some residents that are very independent and deserve the respect of not having that. So it's individualized. Our seventh distinctive would be common areas that create social opportunities in a safe and responsive environment. So as I mentioned, this is critical. In our early days, we used to do all types of programming because inevitably, and I think this was a surprise for our founder, the residents love hanging out with the staff. And while that's great, we want to help them create relationships with people that aren't paid as well. So staff started doing activities, the residents would gather, and then we slowly and purposefully would back the staff out so that the residents would start to do these. And then it took a life of its own. We're now on any given afternoon after people are coming back from work or whatever their day looks like, there's a group of 10, 15 people hanging out, doing a number of different activities, making plans to go to Starbucks or doing, things like that. But there's the social life that happens because of these common areas that were purposefully created to be easily accessible and have programming either that's currently built around them or was built to get these things going. Number 8, as far as our distinctive, and something important from our founders, was shared meals. So for Casa, we offer breakfast and dinner. And certainly a downside of that, you could say, is that we are not helping our residents to be the most independent because they're not cooking every meal for themselves. But when people bring that up to me, I like to point out that, I consider myself pretty independent, but I don't make every meal for myself. My wife will make meals. Sometimes my older kids will make meals. Sometimes we'll order in or we'll go out. So while I have the ability to make my own meal, making my own meal every meal is not a sign of some higher level of independence. Oftentimes eating together is more important than just making that meal. So we do train our residents and work with our residents to have the ability to be independent in that way. But this family dining experience really is at the center of the socialization opportunities. And we see after people eat, them hanging around for 30 minutes, an hour, to be able to socialize and enjoy that time. Another side benefit that we found is by offering these meals, we're able to also guarantee that if people are taking us up on them, which they're not mandatory, that we're able to offer a healthier meal than your typical microwave meal or eating out, which so many of our residents would tend to do given the opportunity. Our 9th distinctive would be 24-hour staffing is provided as part of an IAC, 24-hour awake staffing. So the majority of our residents, if they were living on their own, would not require 24-hour overnight staffing. But what we found is, again, you can't schedule emergencies. And we've had over the years medical emergencies, mental health emergencies, building emergencies. So that 24-hour staff provides that extra level of support, of care. And then it also helps provide some of these things that have come up for our residents. We've been able to provide training, whether it's with CPAP machines or whether it's with different types of fears around lightning, providing that ongoing training because we have staff available. And as some of our residents have aged, and we've created a tier 2 service type for people with more significant medical issues, that 24-hour staffing has been integral to allowing them to stay at Casa or in an IAC model. And then number 10, the last distinctive is that any IAC will offer a lease agreement with all the legal protections of any landlord or tenant agreement. So part of our agreement they have a fully functioning lease agreement that offers them the ability that we just can't kick them out because we decided we don't like them, which would never happen. But we want them to have all of the protections and all the rights afforded to any of us living in the community. So with that, let me talk briefly about what does life in an IAC look like. So at Casa de Amma, at least, and oftentimes in a lot of the IACs that I've seen, we can divide up our service areas in really three distinct categories. The first would be personal and social, and then daily living and work, and then health and well-being. So some of the things under personal social are supports with family, support systems, friends and peers. This is something that I think a lot of people, if they haven't been in residential settings and they're not as familiar, they don't realize how ongoing this is, the need to constantly provide support. Just this morning, before I was getting ready to come on here, we had a few residents who came in and they weren't that happy with a peer and they wanted to talk about it. And we work all these things out through the ability of sitting down and discussing it, helping people see the issue from both sides, giving them a voice, but also not going to the extremes. Social skills and issues, another thing. Romantic, sexual. So all of our residents have different plans and have different abilities and desires. We've had over the years at Casa 2 couples who have gotten married, and we've had multiple other relationships. We also have some residents who the idea of calling someone their girlfriend or boyfriend is the height of dating, and that's great too. So again, we don't either bring people along too fast, but we also don't say no to things that as adults with dignity, they have the right to do, and we work individually with that, with their family. And then spiritual, supporting them, finding their spiritual needs and desires in the local community. The second category, daily living and work, we offer support with personal finance, bill paying, SSI, all of that type of stuff. Also work and meaningful activity, assisting them in finding work, maintaining their jobs, apartment living and personal care, so helping them keep their apartments up, all the things that go with personal care, laundry, the ability to keep up all of their activities of daily living. And then the last one, which is one that's grown over the years, is the health and well-being. So we feel like it's critical to be able to take our residents to doctor's appointments, oversee those types of things. Again, it's not mandatory. We do have a couple of residents who want to do that independently. And, we talk to the family, we talk to them, we point out the pros and cons, but that's their choice. Long-term health, looking at possible issues that will present themselves over the years that over the time we have had. We actually at Casa had a resident who got cancer and was on hospice. And that was one of those things that was very much working out of the belief of let's not just say no to something. Early in Casa, we thought, well, we could never support someone with that. But over the years, we've realized let's not just say no, let's really look at, well, what does that person need? How are we going to provide that? And if we can't, being honest with the individual and family, but also not just starting with no due to fear or the unknown. And then nutrition and exercise, we have a vast program when it comes to helping them grocery shopping, getting the exercise they need, all of that type of stuff. So what if I want to be part of starting an IAC? So anytime an IAC gets started, whether it's from one person, at Casa, we were fortunate to have a family that really funded the initial part of it, got it started. They built the board, they hired the executive director. And then of course, all the programming was really worked out by the professionals in the field. Or if it's a large group, a lot of the people I've worked with consulting, it's larger groups made up of different people. I like to refer to it as really the pieces of the puzzle. And we have a whole session in our symposium that talks about the different pieces of the puzzle that need to be present to create something like an IAC. So any person or group starting an IAC is united by the need to see a loved one have a supportive, independent community that they can flourish in. Many families with a son or daughter with disabilities are overwhelmed and isolated. They know what their family member needs, but the time and resources to create a new program seem overwhelming and unrealistic. So if you sense the need to start a new IAC in your area and want to be part of its creation, let me just share with you briefly a few different pieces of the puzzle to consider. And again, this is elaborated a lot more on our website, and I'd be happy to talk offline about some of this. But just from a basic 10,000 foot view, here are some of the pieces of the puzzle as far as building a team. The first is building and land. You need to find a person or people that have connections to finding the building, finding the land if you're going to build it from the ground up. Of course, that's a critical piece right there, and something that our founders worked with a real estate agent they knew well to find the perfect lot. The second that we found is that's critical for any team is you might not have finances, you might not have the professional wherewithal, but when you have passion and you're willing to dedicate your time, that goes a long way in starting something, because a lot of this is being present in face-to-face, talking to people, selling people on the idea, and being persistent. So someone who has passion, who has willing to dedicate their time. The third would be professional abilities. Certainly we see this on our board of directors. We have people from multiple professional abilities that we're able to utilize their skill sets. It also starts with people that are building an IAC, that if they have certain, whether it's real estate agent, lawyer, different types of professional abilities, those are critical in getting past those initial phases of the dream to actually making it a reality. A fourth piece of the puzzle would be resources and connections, right? So we might not be that person, but we all know people that know people, right? That seems to be their gift. They know people, they're connected, that you mention someone and they've got a person for that. Those people are critical for this. So being able to sell them on the idea, sell them on the importance, and then them being able to come on and be a part of your team and really connect you with the other pieces is critical. And then lastly, this is oftentimes the biggest factor that's daunting for families or professionals, is the idea of finances. And this session is too short to really go into all the different ways of financing these types of programs. Of course, there's private pay. Some people have done it through tax credits. There's different ways of looking at this, and kind of different ways of slicing it. But what I have found is we have had multiple people approach us saying, if you would build another building, we will fund it. So I have been surprised at realizing how many people there are with money and with a loved one who, if they see others who have professional abilities, who have the passion and time, they are willing to put the funding in, but they want to see a good plan. They want to be certain that their funding is going to work out and not be wasted. So I think if you're not the one with the funding, starting with that idea, the business plan, creating the vision, and then being able to bring those people on with the finances, it usually works pretty well. So again, next steps, if you're interested in Casa de Amma, I would say contact me directly. I would be happy to talk with you about our application process. For our program, we have people that live on site, 35 people, and then we have an off-site program where people live in condos within walking distance. And we can discuss waiting lists for both of those. They look very different. And then also, if you're interested in learning more about the IAC model, certainly contact me. One of the things that I found is usually an individual or an entity does not have all those pieces of the puzzle. And actually a program that got started and modeled after us came to be because there were 3 separate groups that all had toured Casa within 3 months. And I was able to just be the connector, put them together, and then they met each other. They each had a different piece, and they were able to then create this program that now is serving and supporting 45 individuals with IDD. So having some people that act as that central hub, and once you make your needs or desires known, me or Ashley, other people being able to connect people that we know that are maybe looking to do something similar in a similar geographic area. So the IAC group, again, you can look at our website, but it's dedicated to helping individuals and groups work through barriers in order to start IACs in their local area. So you can contact us at our email or contact me directly at Casa de Amma, and I'll put my information up there. And with that, that is the end of my presentation. I don't know, Ashley, if would now be a good time to open it up to some Q&A.